First up, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and thank them for allowing us to walk upon their sacred lands. And my tongue is tied. I think without much ado we will just jump straight into a presentation by Antonio Mazzaclera, who's he's currently manager of the Climate Change Policy Team, which is a big job, for EPSDD, which is Environment. No, forget it.
I don't even know.
Antonio has a science background and has worked in natural resources, climate change and policy around those areas for the last 10 years or so in both the federal and ACT governments. Is that right? Okay, and with no further ado, I'd like you to make him welcome. And we'll find his presentation. Whoops. And if you tell me when to click, I will.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Can everybody hear me at the back? Yes? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting us to give you a briefing as to what we're getting up to in climate change. I'd just like to introduce Sam Maguire, who's in our team as well. So, you know, any other hard questions, please direct them that way. I've got about 20 slides and I do tend to drone on for a bit, so you know, if you just go like this, I'll hurry up. But we can launch straight away. Okay, so what are we doing in the ACT government? We're doing a lot, and today I'm going to talk to you not only about what results we're delivering on in what we call mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also how we're preparing the city to adapt to a warming environment, and finally, what new policies we're developing and what do they mean to us. Okay, the first slide is I hope that you've seen this before. I'm very proud to say that the ACT government has some of the most ambitious emission reduction targets, not just in Australia, but certainly globally. We're up, you know, in the 3 or 4 place. And that's because we've had a government that's been working on climate change for at least 20 years. And we do heed the advice from what's called the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC suggested that industrialized nations should reduce their emissions by 40% on 1990 levels by 2020. And to put that into effect, we enacted the Climate Change and Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act and set some targets under legislation. Now, there's a lot of jurisdictions that say that they have targets, but I think only South Australia and us have legislated targets. So it's not easy to change or dilute those targets, so we can be very proud of that as well. The first target that I'd like to talk to you about is achieving 100% renewable electricity by 2020. That means that we've replaced all of this fossil fuel generated electricity to that coming from renewable sources like wind and solar. And I'm sure that some of you will have seen the different solar farms that we have in the ACT, but we would need to go further afield to see some of the wind farms, so I'm sure that you're familiar with them. And the reason we've decided to go with 100% renewable electricity is if we do that, in one fell swoop we'll reduce our emissions by 40% by 2020. And so that we achieve the first target. And it's taken a lot of work. We've done it in a way that we've actually achieved very good prices for the ACT. But the real work commences now to actually move beyond reducing it from 40% to net zero by 2050 is a really hard task. Our current government has what we call a parliamentary agreement between Labor and the Greens, and they've raised the bar. Instead of coming to a net zero emissions by 2050, they're saying, well, that should be at the latest. So we need to work a little bit harder to try and bring it a little bit faster. Now, that also means that we're going to develop steps along the way. These are what we call interim targets. So, for example, we will have a target on continuous reduction by 2030 and then by 2040. And that's very important because we're sending a very strong signal, not just to the community, but to business, that we mean we're serious, and therefore that they can start to make investment decisions and grow what we call our knowledge economy, which is what we got here in Canberra. As I mentioned, we're not in this alone. We have lots of global partnerships. One very important one is with California, which is a world leader in tackling climate change. But we also have established what we call the Climate Action Roundtable, which is where we brought people, the ministers from other jurisdictions, to Canberra to sit down and talk about how we're actually going to cooperate and seek out opportunities to become more efficient in reducing our emissions instead of us here in Canberra reinventing the wheel. That's just a list of all the different organisations. I won't bore you with the details, but any questions you might have, by all means, tell me now, or you can send us an email and we'll be happy to reply through the Secretariat. Right, so this is where we work. This is where we play. There's a lot of different policies in the ACT. They all have to speak to each other. We've all seen instances where one policy might be saying, take care of your cats, and another might be saying, take care of your dogs, and they don't talk to each other, so there's a bit of a mess. What we're trying to do is to avoid problems. We're trying to avoid quick fixes. We're trying to think what is the best solution into the future for the ACT. And the example that I like to give is about desalination plants. You have all heard of them. There's one in Victoria, there's one in Western Australia. We're coming out of the drought. They invested a lot of money, but it was a short-term fix because now they're mothballed because it's raining again, of course. It costs a lot of money to do the maintenance, and then when they're operating, they're actually operating on using fossil fuel generated electricity, which exacerbates the problem, right? So that's what we call maladaptation, and if we had thought about it a little bit better, we could probably come up with a different and better solution that didn't cost as much. The areas that we work in are climate change mitigation, which we call the Action Plan 2, and I mentioned that we've been working on this for 20 years. Well, my colleagues have. I've only been here for 5. Anna, fortunately for her, has only been here for 2 years now. But we also make sure that we work with energy policy and with waste and transport and strategic planning so that we have a coordinated approach. Next one. I don't expect you to read this. I can barely read it myself, but this is just a map indicating where all of the wind farms and solar farms that we've procured or procuring energy from are situated. As you can see, there's no wind farms in the ACT. We don't have wind resources here. What we've done is we've put up a request for proposals in a reverse auction process, and companies that were installing wind farms as far away as South Australia would then put a bid, and that actually depressed the prices. They became lower and lower. We achieved the lowest prices in Australia at that time, and so we got a very good deal. In addition to that, there was a number of criteria that we looked at. Were the proposals supported by the local community? We didn't want to actually support a wind farm that was not supported by the local community, so that was a very important factor. But we also looked at what other things the proposal could bring to the ACT. And through that, we've secured a lot of investment in research, development, and businesses here in the ACT. And again, as I mentioned, the knowledge economy is what we have. We don't have heavy industry, so we try and promote activity that will grow our knowledge economy so we can export that to the rest of Australia and the world. By the way, this presentation is saved on your computer, so if you need any of the slides or anything, you do have access to them. So, purchasing renewable electricity costs money. It cost, at that time, cost a little bit more than just buying fossil fuel generated electricity. So what we've done is we looked at, okay, how can we actually become more efficient in using electricity and therefore use less? And if we take those savings from using less with the extra cost of buying renewable electricity, then we've pretty much balanced out from here to 2020. And so there's a number of different programs within government. I hope that you've heard about ACSMO, where they will go to small businesses and households and help you with your light bulbs or with other energy efficiency measures to try and reduce the amount of electricity that you have to purchase. We are also not just telling you, the community, what to do, we're actually doing it ourselves. So we have what we call a carbon neutral government framework target. That means that government operations will be carbon neutral by 2020. And that's forcing us to look at what we need to do to reduce our emissions overall. How do we use less electricity? How do we use less fuel? How do we consume less? What energy efficiency white goods, for example, or systems do we need to install in order for us to achieve that target? And through that, we're demonstrating that we can achieve reductions in emissions without breaking the bank, and we have case studies that we can share with the community and businesses. I mentioned some of the goodies that we got through some of the proposals or some of the contracts where we purchased renewable electricity. Through that, we've got a very interesting project where we will be generating hydrogen in the ACT next year, sufficient to run a fleet of at least 20 hydrogen-powered vehicles. And I think we're the first jurisdiction in Australia to have that number of vehicles deployed. And that'll generate a lot of awareness, but it also generate data for us to continue to assess if that technology is going to be a viable option for us in the future. At the moment, it's rather expensive. It's some technical hurdles, but it's a very viable alternative into the future. The other thing that we're working on is I'm sure some of you have rooftop solar systems. You would have been party to what we call the feed-in tariff, where if you produce more electricity than what you use, you sell it back into the grid, the government pays you a top-up, and that way your system can pay for itself on average around 7 years, right? The problem with that is that, of course, these solar cells only generate electricity when the sun is shining. What happens when you're at work and all of this electricity is being generated and the price fluctuates? What you can do is install a battery that will charge up when the price of electricity to sell is low, and then it can sell it on your behalf to the market when the price is high, when the demand is high, which is usually around midday. It also means that when you come home, you turn on the lights and they work. You don't depend on the network, you are becoming self-sufficient. We are rolling out up to 5,000 of these battery systems through a series of calls for expressions of interest from the community. So if you have a solar system in your rooftop, at the moment you can go into our website and put in a request to be part of this process where we will give you a subsidy for the purchase of a battery system. There's a little sting in the tail is that we will request the information that's being generated, not your personal information, but the information on the use of the coupling between the solar cells and the battery. And we need that information because, again, we need to establish some baselines to understand how we can continue to improve our energy independence. So, that's all great. We're working on reducing our emissions, but unfortunately, even if we stopped all emissions right now globally, if the whole world all of a sudden decided no more emissions, no more burning of fossil fuels, we still have enough of those greenhouse gases accumulated in the atmosphere that the planet will continue to warm. It'll continue to warm into the future for decades to come until it reaches a new equilibrium point. At the moment, what we're trying to do is to reduce our emissions so that new equilibrium means that the planet doesn't warm up beyond 2 degrees. And it's a difficult task because it's a global effort. So, in spite of our best efforts, we will continue to warm up in Canberra, and therefore we need to prepare for that. That's what we call adaptation. Farmers are very good at it. They do it every day, and I'm sure businesses do as well. We all do it. You know, if things change, we adapt to them. A few years ago, there was no mobile phones. Now everybody has one. So there's those sorts of things that we do where we anticipate what's going to happen, and we prepare for them, and we change our behavior to what we call adaptation. Next one. Now, the problem is to define what we need to adapt to. When I've spoken to you, and I think I addressed the same group about more than a year ago, I talked about this project that we call NARCLIP. When we talk about climate change, we usually talk about global climate models. And these are very sophisticated computer models that simulate what's happening in the atmosphere-ocean interface and then project what's going to happen to the temperature and to the climate into the future. And it's a very complicated piece of work. There's a lot of different models. Some are better than others for different types of parameters. The ACT, together with New South Wales, were the first ones in Australia that came together and looked at these global models and asked the University of New South Wales to select the better ones for the eastern part of Australia and then do what's called statistical downscaling. Please don't ask me what that means. The effect is that they've gone from a very large global scale, 100 by 100 kilometer grid scale, down to a 10 by 10 kilometer scale and focused on our region. So now we have a much better awareness of what's going to happen in the ACT. And for me as a person that works in climate change, it helps me a lot. It helps me a lot because I can come to groups like this and talk to you about what's going to happen in our city, not something that's going to happen in China or Antarctica or somewhere else. This is what's going to happen here. The message is something that you've already heard a number of times. It's going to get warmer, and the rainfall, instead of occurring throughout the year, is going to be concentrated into more intense events. So there's going to be stronger downpours, and there's going to be more incidents of flooding. There's going to be more extended heat waves, which is a very big concern for us, and it's also going to be more intense bushfires, similar to what happened in 2003. What keeps me worried at night sometimes is that nature doesn't throw you one problem at a time, it likes to throw you several. So we might have an extended drought, and then we have a very intense heat wave, and then we have a bushfire all at one time. So we need to prepare for the worst scenario, again, looking at how do we adapt. And it's important because I mentioned earlier on that we're going to warm up 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degrees into the future, and people say, well, 1 degree is no problem. I turn the air conditioning for a little while, that's fine. That's just the average. The reality is, and you all know, that the temperature varies a lot. So when we actually hit the extremes up here is when our systems and our ability to deliver essential services and to take care of ourselves is challenged. Another example is what happened in Melbourne a few years ago when all of a sudden the temperature spiked at 46 degrees. It was unfortunately during the tennis event, so a lot of people got caught out. There was a lot of incidents of heat stroke, transport failed, the tram lines buckled, so all of a sudden we had starting to have the beginning of a catastrophe. Fortunately, the City of Melbourne managed to respond, and the incidence of extreme heat strokes was not that great. But that's the sort of thing that we have to prepare for, and that's why we need to think in a longer term basis.
So excuse me,
Yes.
How accurate are these models? Have you tested them? Whatever they predicted, is that?
They don't predict what's going to happen on a day-to-day basis. Not even the weather climate models, the local weather projections can do that. What they do is they tell you about the average trend. And so when the scientists create a model, what they do is they think about, okay, what's going to happen with the cloud system, with the sun, with the irradiation from the sun in this particular part of the planet. And then they do what's called backcasting. So what we do is we project the model into the past, not just into the future. And when we project back into the past, we look at the records. And so some of the models have proven to be very good in a particular region for temperature. Others are very good for rainfall. And that's what we call a model has a skill for a particular parameter. And so when we developed this project, we took those models that are actually most skilled for this part of Australia. So it's never going to be able to give you, this is what's going to happen this year. It will tell you that overall, within 10 years, the average of days over 35 degrees is going to double. So by 2030, it's going to be double. And so if you have that in the back of your mind, then you can start to make decisions as to, will the type of crops that I have now be suitable for that point in time? Probably not. So I can start to transition to crops that can resist that temperature. Okay? Next one. Just some of the things that are going to change that I've mentioned. There's going to be more heat waves. Severe fire weather is going to be more common. There's going to be more expense in trying to keep your home comfortable. In the sense of right now it's mostly by heating, but in the future it's going to flip over and it's going to be in cooling. Water is going to continue to, at times, to be a commodity in the sense that we're going to go through droughts. We mentioned the urban forest. Canberra is very lucky to have such a lovely, what we call urban forest. You know, there's trees everywhere, and we're enjoying what planners and developers did back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Thanks to them, we have such a beautiful amount of trees. We're not doing the same. We're not doing the maintenance. The number of trees are going down. We need to address that, because if we have trees, we have shade. And they enhance the soil, they retain the water, they prevent flooding. So there's a lot of benefits to trees, and we tend to kind of like not think of them because we're surrounded by them. The last point that I'd like to make is about our ecosystems. Our poor native animals are suffering because they cannot evolve quickly enough to keep abreast of the changes in the climate. So we need to try and help them by removing other factors that are stressing them, like exotic species eating them up, or changes in agriculture that's having a runoff that's impacting on their environment. So if we take care of the environment and provide refuges for them, they'll be better prepared to try and adapt to the climate change. All of this work is being encapsulated in a strategy that was released last year. It has 27 actions, and that's a lot of work. And we're supposed to deliver them by 2020. So it's a very short time frame in which we need to do a lot of work. Now, the reason for that is that most of these actions are geared towards government doing them. But there's also a component where we acknowledge that we can't do everything, and we will be seeking advice and support from the community and providing you with information so that you can help yourselves. So it's a partnership approach. We've separated into those key sectors, which to come to this point, we had a series of meetings throughout 2014 and 2015. Quite a few hundred submissions came in, and at the end of the day, we had settlements and infrastructure. What do we need to do in order for the buildings into the future will be fit for purpose? That means that they'll be comfortable and that you don't need to use a lot of energy to keep them comfortable when it's hotter outside. What do we do to protect our natural resources and ecosystems? I mentioned trying to reduce the other stresses that they have. How do we manage water? We have to look after the community. Sadly, those that are least capable of taking care of themselves because they're elderly or infirm or poor are the ones that are going to be the most impacted by climate change. when it's really hot, people that have a bit more disposable income, if you want to call it, can turn on the air conditioning. But people who don't have an air conditioning, or if they do, they don't dare turn it on because of the cost, will be able to protect themselves less, right? So we have to increase their resilience. We have to take care of all of our community. And finally, I mentioned there's bushfires, etc. We have to keep very, very much on our toes to ensure that the response that we have to these natural disasters is the best that they can. This little chart is just to explain how we're progressing on delivering on those 27 actions. Remember, the finish line is by 2020. The vast majority are in the green, so we are progressing them well. The amber or yellow means that we're working, but we're finding that we might need more information, or we didn't quite get the action right, so we're negotiating with other agencies across government to deliver on those. And there's only one at the back that we haven't been able to progress as much as we would like, but I am assured, and I can assure you, that by next month, that red bicycle should be at least yellow, okay? So I hope that next time I come and speak to you, all the bicycles will be truly on the ground and all the riders will be drinking a beer somewhere because we've completed all of them. Next one. So we've talked about what we've done, we've talked about adaptation, and now we have to talk about, okay, well, we're doing really well to 2020, but what are we going to do from 2020 to 2050? And that's where we need to have a much broader conversation with the community, because the more we try to reduce our emissions, the harder it's going to be, and the more of a bigger role does the individual and the community have in helping us get there. To that effect, next one. Our vision is to maintain the city in the beautiful state that we are enjoying it in for future generations. And that means that the amenity levels are high, that it continues to be a city that attracts people because it offers the jobs, it offers an economy, safety, and it's a really nice place to be in. We have held 2 roundtables. There was well over 60 attendees at each one of these roundtables, and they represented a number of few community groups. And what we did was ask them how would they address some of these problems, how would they address some of these issues that we're facing. And we're taking all of that information, we're working with consultants who are very good at modeling some of the options and what they mean in the sense of emissions reduction. And we're bringing all of this information together before we go back to the community with an idea, a plan. The way that government works is we have a number of ideas, we go back to the community and we say, which one do you think is going to work the best? And together with those ideas, we include how much it's going to reduce our emissions and how much it's going to cost. So the decision and the power to influence that will be back with the community. So we're developing this, what we call a pathway. The thing about a pathway is that you can change direction, you can meander a little bit. It means that we're not locked into it from here to 2050. What we'll do is we'll set interim targets and then possibly every 5 years go back to the community and say, this has worked, this isn't working, there's new technology that's coming up, what do you think? We believe that this is A, B, C are the best options, what do you think? So every 5 years or so, we're going to have another iterative process to ensure that we're tracking and that everybody's coming along for the journey. That there's no point in us just going by ourselves and saying, this is what we're going to do, it's never going to work. And I mentioned at the beginning, we need to integrate our thinking across different policies in government. Working in silos doesn't work anymore. What we call business as usual is not going to cut it into the future. We might have world-class health facilities. Some may argue that we don't, but compared to many other places, I can assure you that we have excellent health facilities. But the way that we run those facilities might not work in the future because the population is going to continue to grow. A larger percentage of that population is going to be elderly, myself in there. and therefore we might require more support and more help. So we need to start to invest now in order to grow the systems and the facilities to be able to cater for a growing demand. And a very important aspect, just before we finish, is to, in doing all of this, if we plan ahead, we can start to capture the opportunities from being first or early movers. Just like I said that a lot of businesses are looking at Canberra now, we can continue that trend and we can continue to grow our knowledge economy and develop the jobs that will keep our youth employed and ourselves employed into the future. These are the challenges that we're facing. I talked about, you know, what the consultants are doing in telling us what the issues are. This little donut looks at the different sectors and tells us where the majority of the emissions are coming from. Up until 2020, 64% of our emissions are coming from power consumption. Because we're moving to renewable electricity, by 2020, electricity or energy consumption will diminish, and the biggest emitter will be transport. And that's you and me using cars and even public transport. So we need to start to think, how can we actually start to reduce those emissions? Not everybody can go and buy an electric vehicle. They're way too expensive. But certainly we can start to use public transport a bit more. What does that mean? How do we make it better? How do we make it a better experience from the beginning of the journey to the end of the journey, not just while you're on the bus? How can we electrify transport? And the light rail is a good example. We've also just started a trial with 3 electric buses to see how it works. And we have to look what the technology is going to do in the future. As electric vehicles become more abundant, the price will drop. So we might have to hold back a little bit and then plan to put some incentives or some assistance, you know, the carrot and the stick, so that people are a bit more incentivized to actually consider getting an electric vehicle into the future, or even better, use public transport, use active transport, which is walking and bicycles, or if they actually have to use a car, rent it instead of owning it. So all those are the things that we have to consider. Next one. I think this is the final one. I hope for you that it is. This graph might look complicated, but it's just a reflection of all of the different sectors and how much they contribute to emissions. And what we're doing is we're looking at 3 different options. What do we need to do in order to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050? So it's a much gentler curve compared to 2040. That's going to be a lot harsher and cost more. And then we have 2030. I do not think that, this is my personal opinion, I don't think that we're going to quite make it to 2030, but maybe around here we might have the opportunity to actually reduce our emissions if we go about it in a planned way. That might be it.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
All right then. Thank you very much. Some questions, sir?
Thank you, Antonia. I'm glad that we're going to zero emissions. I'm just a bit confused about them though. If it's night time and there's no wind blowing, how are we powering our systems if we're not making any emissions? The energy is likely to come from a coal station.
At the moment,
sorry, a coal power.
yeah, at the moment the answer is yes, and that's why all both coal and renewable energy sources are going in through the national electricity network.
So what are we doing about alternatives to that, storage and stuff? I know you're doing it in a small scale housing.
Exactly.
But are there any other ways of doing it?
There's many different ways. As you know, for example, South Australia has just gone ahead and has commissioned the largest largest battery system in the world. That's one approach, so that when the wind is blowing, any excess energy that's produced, and it does blow at night as well, is stored in those batteries, which can then release it when it's most needed. But that's just one approach. The other approach is to, there's talk about pump hydro, which is a very simple system. You have 2 ponds at different heights. when the electricity, when there's wind blowing or when the sun is shining and you have excess electricity, you pump the water up and it's stored as potential energy. When you need the energy at night, you let it go and you have a generator, and basically that's the Snowy hydro system. So there's...
I'm sorry, I think that's an old technology that's just days and done. The battery's better, but that's expensive, it's environmental. There's a half hour or whatever to get your energy from pumped hydro. The battery's instant, cheaper, and the new world.
There's a lot of
Yep.
efficiencies.
Look, there's pros and cons to every system. The thing about the hydro is that it is very reliable technology, and yes, there is a lag time between when you press a button and it starts to generate, but there are very sophisticated systems now that are actually monitoring the energy used by in seconds, in quantities of every few seconds, I think, or even less. So there are algorithms now that can predict exactly when you need to actually start pushing a button to bring that capacity online. So I agree with you on that point. Yes?
The zero net emissions target for 2050 applies only to emissions that happen in the ACT.
Yes.
Right, now, we haven't had any emissions from electricity generation in the ACT since 1957, when the Kingston Power Station closed. The renewable energy that we bought is reducing emissions from the electricity that comes into the ACT. It's not reducing emissions in the ACT. So it's doing a really useful thing from the planet's point of view. But we still have somewhere around 10 tonnes per person of emissions in things that are brought into the ACT or in interstate travel, international travel. You buy a hamburger, the wheat is grown in Western New South Wales or somewhere, producing emissions from the fertiliser and everything else. It gets milled and it gets turned into a bun in Sydney. The emissions from baking are not counted in the ACT. It gets trucked from Sydney to here, those emissions don't get counted. If you add up all the emissions like that, it comes to about 10 tonnes per person per year. Now, to put that in perspective, the average person in India causes in total about 2 tonnes of emissions per year, which is roughly what we need to get the planet to make it survivable.
Yep.
The average person in the world is causing about 5 tonnes per year, which is too much. We're causing about 10 tonnes per person per year of emissions just in the stuff we bring into the ACT. So how are we going to address that?
Okay, I completely agree with all of the points that you've made. It is true that we have an economy that's structured into consumerism. And, you know, whenever an economist, and I hope there might be an economist in the room, but I've always had this discussion, is, you know, growth is good. And I challenge that. I don't know that growth is always going to be good, and in this case, bigger and bigger is not necessarily going to help us resolve this problem. So yes, we do need to, in the trajectory perhaps from here to 2050, start to think, okay, how can we reduce the core problem, which is a consumerist, throwaway society? And that requires behaviour change.
Well, part of the problem is that the emissions in Australia as a whole, the emissions per capita are essentially, give or take, the emissions that are caused by the people.
Yep.
But because we don't produce much in the ACT, we're probably are greater consumers than the rest of Australia, but not by much. It's just a trick of accounting that says that a lot of emissions that we cause don't happen in the ACT.
Yep.
We do have ways of influencing those, and what are we doing about that?
Okay, I'll take a step back. The way that we account for the emissions, and it's a national and international approach in the way that we actually count who's emitting what, and the way that we've decided to do it across Australia is that we are responsible for what's called Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So if we consume something here, then we account for those emissions. What we're starting to talk about is Scope 3 emissions. So for example, when we purchase building material, concrete is one that's frequently mentioned, air travel is another, we're actually importing those goods, using them here, but we're not accounting for them. They get accounted where they were produced or manufactured. The reality is that it would be possibly better, more fair, if we actually looked at it on a per capita consumption and emission. At some point from here to 2050, we have a lot of work in actually reducing Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but at some point we need to have the discussion as to how can we seriously start to reduce Scope 3 emissions. And it will be by, for example, agreeing with other jurisdictions that we need to look at food miles, for example. So that will incentivize more local food production. And that's, and we have to think, is that more efficient to grow food here with the associated fertilizers and water and climatic issues, or is it more efficient to have a big farm in Queensland, for example? So at the moment, the reality is that very few people are thinking ahead in that aspect. At the moment, we're just trying to kind of grapple with the big problem of just Scope 1 and 2 emissions. But, as I say, at some point in that curve, we have to start to consider how we can improve our performance.
An ETS.
I couldn't say that. Sorry, I think it was first year.
How about mandatory 5-star energy ratings on all new buildings? Maybe an improved energy rating on buildings being renovated, and mandatory solar, electricity and hot water on all new buildings. And eaves on houses.
Yes.
And make it face north with the right way.
Particularly on Northbourne Avenue and Flemington Road, what pressure can you put on the government and the planners and the approvers to have developers site houses and apartment blocks the right way?
Well, I'll speak off the record, if that's possible.
That's fine.
But the reality is, no, that's all right. The reality is that, you know, we do still have a number of silos across government. And so we are one silo, and we're trying to mainstream consideration of issues that we need to address for climate change across all of government operations. That takes a little bit of time. If you think of any society as, you know, I was going to call it the Titanic, but I prefer to call it the Queen Mary, because that one didn't sink. To actually move it takes a lot of effort and persistent effort. So it's not something that we're going to fix straight away. Both the Action Plan 2, which I mentioned, and especially the adaptation strategy talk about how can we improve design and how do we improve overall solar features in houses and in buildings, so that we start to move away from, you know, we're all in it together, consuming the same type of buildings that are being produced as sausages, instead integrating to something that initially is going to cost more. There's no illusions about that. It's going to cost more initially, but it will save us more in the long term. And some people are not prepared to do that. Then some people are struggling to have enough money for a deposit, and therefore they're going to go for the cheaper house, which is probably the most inefficient in the sense of energy consumption.
I think you're talking about 10% more at most. If it's built in the original, maybe not even that. I think it's even less.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. We had
Yeah,
one
sorry.
and then two. Sorry, if you
Yeah, sort of, I guess slightly following on from that, you've mentioned the urban forest, and I was quite interested in that when you came to speak to us, I think, last year. And we've had developments that have been presented to us, I think, a couple of months ago, and I've asked, how have you incorporated greenery, and they pointed out a small patch of grass on the roof, and I'm like, yeah, that's good, but I was thinking a bit more. But and how are you going with getting developments and incorporating that into planning or building laws and more green? Yeah, I can imagine.
It is hard, and again, there's a lot of momentum behind it.
Yeah.
So to change a whole industry perspective into providing perhaps less square meter that is built
Mm.
but providing more square meters where you can plant a tree is hard, because they make more money
Mm.
by selling more house than
Mm.
less.
Well,
And-
Jeff is
and
right,
so-
it's by
and-
legislation.
Exactly.
You, you
So-
definitely need to do it in the planning or
So we need to do the approach of the regulation, which is the
Yeah.
carrot, the stick, and then the carrot, where we provide other incentives. Before I come back to you, the lady had a question.
I have really been impressed with the presentation. It's been illuminating, and I'm really delighted that these targets are there and that you've already done so much to move in that direction. You mentioned that some of these targets are legislated.
Yes.
If a different political party comes in, what happens to those regulations and that legislation? Because in the normal circle of government, some of those sorts of things can often go around in a circle.
Exactly, yes. Just like we had in the Commonwealth, right? So at
Exactly.
the end of the day, it depends on all of us and the freedom to vote and to elect a particular group of politicians. The fact that they're in legislation means that they can't be changed overnight.
Yes.
That they will need to go and have the discussion with the community and then with their own cabinet before they can put a change to legislation forward. If it was just a policy, they can, whomever comes in can just basically walk away from it and put in a different policy almost overnight. So that's the measure of protection that we have under legislation. I think you reviewed, yes?
With my economist hat on,
Yes.
about 10 years ago or a bit more, the German Environment Department estimated that global warming would cost about 10% of the world's economy. Has anybody estimated how much it's going to cost the ACT economy?
I don't think so. I honestly don't know the answer to that, and I can look into it if you like. I don't know that there's that information,
I think it's something we need to start thinking
but
of.
it would be a very good instrument or tool to actually bring to bear. And speaking about trees and the benefits, and I'm sure I mentioned it last year when I came here, but people tend to disregard trees because they only look at the cost of planting them, and then the fact that they drop their leaves and they're a nuisance at some point in time, right? But you really have to look at all of their benefits. The simplest one is the real estate prices in leafy suburbs are higher because they're leafy, right? And that's because some trees will provide you with shade in summer, and as the leaves drop, they will allow the sun to come in during winter. So you find that suburbs that are leafier will actually cost less for the houses around there to maintain thermal comfort. And then there's other benefits, for example, health benefits, mental health benefits of having greenery around. The problem that we see that's systemic is that when people are projecting the cost of something, they only look at the initial, cost. They don't, what I call, monetize the benefits. If you look at the whole of life benefits accruing from trees, they will pay for themselves. Not a problem. Sorry, yes?
I think there's modelling available that looks at ecosystem services, is what you were talking about there.
That's right.
And I could segue that back to the mention that you were talking about the urban forest, and also link it back to what these other people are saying about, and you just mentioned thermal comfort. There's going to be an explosion of high-rise development along Northbourne, and heaven help us, possibly even in West Basin. And basically, I don't think there's going to be much thought about urban forests involved there at all. And yet you need to sort of bring in ecosystem services, and that has been monetised. There's models that are available that look at the importance over time of having leafy suburbs and greenery, and it does diminish the thermal mass. And I just think there's a wonderful opportunity for the ACT government and Canberrans to lead the world again in looking at densification that includes all these parameters and that factors them in. And I'm just wondering, I know you're working with silos, but are you getting any buy-in at all with development applications, with the developers, cadre, all the people who are putting pressure on the ACT government to build high-rise and unfortunately not really think about these things?
In the government, we are thinking actively about it, and when I say we talk about strategic planning and building policy, and so, you know, the urban redevelopment that's happening. I, for one, and I put it as a very simple example, I, for one, would not like to live in a hotter, more densely populated city. We would have riots. I've never seen any newscast from the riots in Europe happening in winter. They always happen in summer, don't they? And that's because people are suffering all sorts of stresses, and I'm sure that temperature and a lack of ability to escape it is contributing to that. So we are thinking actively about it. We do not want to recreate or have ghettos and have places where there's high density but there's no greenery around it. There's pros and cons to having high density and tall buildings, but you have to provide greenery around it. Otherwise it becomes a city that nobody wants to live in, to be honest. Now, your question goes to the heart as to how much influence we have, and through the process of actually changing regulation, changing the territory plan, and changing the sign standards, which is not an easy process, I can assure you, because it's in law. We will start to make improvements to developments into the future. That's all I can say.
That's one way of doing it.
Yep.
Another way of doing it is to use the market by educating the consumers, people who buy houses, the people who rent places, to better understand how the design and the way a building is made will affect their lives. So I know at my workplace, the 20-year-olds, the 25-year-olds just have no idea. They wouldn't consider aspect. They wouldn't consider insulation. They just don't understand. If they're told about it, then the developers won't be selling badly aspected buildings.
There's three things I'd like to mention.
So what I'm encouraging you to do is have a better informed consumer.
That's quite correct. I think at the end of the day, it depends on the individual purchasing choices. So if I go and see, well, you know, these are eggs coming from a battery pan production system or open range, then that's where we start to make those decisions. These cost a little bit more, but you know, I feel better about it, right? And I hope the chickens do as well. We need to continue the education and start not just on adults, but for when we you know, targeting specifically young ones. Young ones are natural born scientists. They're curious about things. All of a sudden, when they start to hit, you know, teenage years and the hormones kick in, they kind of forget about it. But eventually, they come back. So if we instill some principles about what is sustainability and what they should be looking at and how to live a more sustainable life, hopefully that will rub off in the decisions they're making to the future. The second point that
do you see a role of government in that?
Absolutely.
Well, so that's what I'm encouraging you to spend the money on.
Great, and we have a lot of programs already through ACSMART, but the second part that you mentioned was about talking to industry and demonstrating that they can have a competitive edge by putting more features that make a house more comfortable, that the experience of living of that house is going to be better. A lot of the times when we talk to the real estate agents, they say, you know, the fact that you're saving the world is not going to be here nor there. You know, people don't care. They just care about the prestige, about, you know, how flashy the house is. So we need to work with that industry to say, well, you have to sell the values and the features of this household. You know, it's got insulation, not because it's going to save the world, but because it will reduce your operating costs, right, to keep that house comfortable. Because it's the latest feature that will make you look better than that older house down the block. You know, it is a little bit of a competitive thing. But we also need to talk to the builders to say, if you start to integrate these buildings, you will have a competitive edge in the market. And so it's an education to everybody about how we start to change behavior. Yes.
I've just got a bit of a comment and question on gas
Right.
and emissions. I noticed from your chart that it seemed to account for about 15% of emissions in the ACT. But just from my own personal experience, I converted my house from gas to electricity to reverse cycle heating, and managed to halve my energy bills just by doing. I mean, it did cost me about $4,000, but it is.
It'll pay for
Will
itself.
pay for itself in
Yep.
about 4 years, but I only really understood that when I started looking into electricity and gas prices, and I got involved a little bit with a community reference group with ActuAGL. But it's actually quite difficult to work out how much things cost, and there's this perception that reverse cycle air conditioners are very inefficient, but in fact they're extremely efficient now, and you can get extremely efficient reverse cycle air conditioners. And also heat pump technology, you can get very efficient heat pump for hot water as well. And I don't think that there's a general awareness in the community that people can move to this electric only households, and with our move to complete renewable electricity, you'd be slashing. I think it'd be almost very easy to reduce that gas component of our emissions, but it would just require a bit of awareness for consumers and how to do that.
Yes, you're right, and I think that one of the things that we're not very good at is actually promoting our work.
Yeah.
In 2013, we did a survey of 1,200 households, and we asked them about attitudes towards climate change and what the government was doing. Everybody said, "You're doing great. Working on climate change is great. We support it." Then when we asked them, "Do you know what the government is doing?" Only 40% said, "Oh, I think so."
Yeah.
Now, we've started to ramp our advertising, media, etc., promotion, and 3 years later, in 2016, we did exactly the same survey, and it had jumped from 40% to 58%. And I can't quote the numbers now about the uptake of the services that the government offers through ACSMART, but we're actively promoting the uptake of more energy efficient measures, discouraging to a certain point gas. Gas in itself is becoming more expensive, so people are starting to wake up to the fact that maybe electricity appliances are better. So it is going to take a bit of time for the consumers, but also the retailers to actually promote those words as something that will keep you comfortable and save you money. So we can do better in that, definitely.
Okay, we've got one last question and then we'll have to wind it up.
On from that, we're trying to build a passive house at the minute, and to find out information on that was very difficult. To give an example, a passive house that we visited in Chifley, the people there haven't turned on their electric heating, or they don't have cooling, but they haven't turned on the heating for 3 years. If you build it well, it isn't needed. But to find out information on the process of building one is quite difficult in Australia, and particularly here. Hardly anyone knows about it, and it might be useful if the government was able to provide some help and information on that.
Yeah, there is information. There is some available already, but we could do a lot better in that for sure. It's as a person that I also looked at some point building my own house. There was so much information, and it was here and it was there and everywhere that I just felt completely incapable of taking the first step. So I guess if we had a program or a system where we can actually assist and support people making those decisions, I think we might increase the uptake. And once you have 2 or 3, hopefully they'll be happy to be the focus of attention from other groups and people that want to follow their example.
Okay, well thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enlightening, informative. There's even a laugh in there. So
Yeah, I hope so.
we thank you very much, people.
So if I may, I'll excuse myself from let you continue with your meeting.
Oh yeah, all right, you're excused.
Thank you kindly. Good night.
Good night.
Sorry?
You've got your memory stick over there.
Yeah.
No, we gave it to him.
Yeah. All right then. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we want... There are a number of apologies for tonight, including Mike Hettinger and John Lieber, both doing some school concert thing. There are others listed and unlisted. I apologise for them. Any potential conflicts of interest? I'm not aware of any personally. Anybody else got any? Good, no. Okay. Quickly just review and confirm the minutes of the last meeting, which have been circulated, but if you want to know anything more, but basically, are they approved?
For those, if you were at last month's meeting, there's a copy of the draft minutes.
Okay. I'll take it as read that basically they're approved.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Jeff. New members. I had a list and I've lost it. So there are some new members. Okay. And reports. The Treasurer is absent, as mentioned, at a school concert. I don't know how a school concert for your child could have priority over such a fine meeting, but there you go. I don't have children old enough to, or young enough to go to a school concert, except as parents. It says chair, I presume that's me. This month I attended the Environment Planning Forum, which is a bi-monthly thing that I attend on your behalf. And we did a little bit of a discussion on reverse auctions for renewable energy, which we mentioned today. Tharwa Village Master Plan has been released, and unfortunately you've missed their open day and come fair, which was the weekend before last. But Tharwa Village now has its own master plan. We had a bit of a chat about how statistics are used in planning and whatever, which was quite interesting. But most interesting for me, and you might not be able to see this, but was a discussion about the mowat tree. Now, some of you may have heard of the mowat tree, and the mowat tree is named after the same person as Mowat Street in Lyneham. What it is about is way back in the distant past, when they were mapping the ACT, the surveyors would use rock cairns or trees, and trees in particular, which they would carve in directions to say the actual border is 50 yards to the west of here, and travels like that, and they would do, and these are hard to see, but there's little hieroglyphics cut into the tree which tell people that's where you do and what you go. The mowat tree was discovered in almost our most southern corner of the ACT, but it was dying, and like many of these trees dotted around all of our border, they've been dying off because unfortunately trees die. They've rescued this one and they've put it on display, or they are putting it on display. I thought it was brilliant. So I only have one of these, unfortunately, but if anybody wants to take a quick look at that and find out more about the mowat tree and where it's going to be presented, feel free. And then I left the meeting because I had to do other things. But that's about the sum total of my report for the month. Okay. In case you're not aware, next month will be our annual general meeting, which you're all welcome to attend, and please twist the arms of anybody else you know to come along. It will be a fun-filled event, I'm sure. Okay, now there's a number of things here which I'm not up with. The Combined Community Council, Jane, do you know something in particular there, or?
Only that they're looking at us hosting that meeting in November.
Yep.
And so we need to agree on a date and possibly book this venue on the Saturday, the 18th of November, if that's possible. Mars is here, so I can.
Sure.
But do we want to have a discussion now, or should we leave it to the committee?
No, I'll leave it to the committee, that's good. Lakutia hang on, have I scrolled down far enough? I have. Lakutia Housing and Planning Inquiry, submission is due the 31st of October. Heavy duty stuff. But you really need to read the assembly briefs and whatever on this.
I'm expecting to put something together, and I mean, obviously the Inner South Canberra Community Council is working very hard on putting a submission into the inquiry, and whether I can actually have it in draft form in time for our next meeting on the 18th of October, I'm not sure. But I think it's really important. This is, I don't know, honestly, I don't know why it's called a housing inquiry. My understanding was it was meant to be the inquiry into planning in the ACT. So it never made sense to me to call it a housing inquiry because that constrains the scope. And the reality is, you know, I've been concerned now for quite a number of years with the way in which the legislation works in the ACT. The Planning and Development Act, together with the Territory Plan and the regulations that accompany the Planning and Development Act, have extinguished appeal rights in all sorts of areas of planning. And I think that that's a really major issue. Not to mention the way in which the exemptions and the certification and so on work. So I mean, there are a great many things there.
Yeah, I can imagine there'll be a lot of submissions by developers wanting rule changes and to be able to build more on housing blocks, maybe change RZ1s to be more flexible. So, yeah, I'd be concerned. I think we need submissions.
I mean, if it's possible to put together a working group on this, I think it would actually be a much more efficient way of handling, and then at least it's possible to start to break it up into chunks, because otherwise it would cover the whole thing.
I'd like to add to that. I haven't been telling the rest of the council, but Mary Ann and I, we, as you know, developed a development checklist that we would like to see provided with all the applications. And I forwarded on to Shane Ratton, who forwarded on to Caroline, and she suggested I should forward it on to ACLA and ask them about. I finally got an answer today. They're saying, we do have a checklist, but we can't show it to you. and we're not allowed to. And I said, well, I would like to see that put up so it would make it easier for everyone.
The checklist is in the TDocs. So when you take something, if you take something to the tribunal, you'll get their checklist.
Yes. But you don't before that.
No.
So we could speed up
We've all got copies of TDocs.
and improve the whole development process. If the developer filled it out, and then they'd know if they're compliant, the ACLA would look at it, and then they'd know it's compliant, because I'm still getting non-compliant development applications coming into Braden. This shouldn't have got through the, shouldn't have got out through the box.
The official checklist is called the Territory Plan, and we know that ACLA doesn't have the time to check every aspect of every development application. So if they were to publicly release their checklist, then the builders would say, all right, we can forget everything else in the Territory Plan and just build to that.
I think also that one of the major
issues that will need to be brought forward is it's fine to look at and inquire into planning, into housing in the ACT, but unless you have a partner side by side with that of compliance, properly regulated compliance regime, you may as well blow planning out the window. You have to have compliance, and until the government is prepared to put money, put resources into compliance for some of the regulations that are already there, you really are just wasting your time.
So should we all give up now?
Are there other people willing to work on this?
Pardon?
Are there other people in the room willing to work on this?
I mean, essentially we've got a month. I'm happy to
review it, but
contribute.
I'm not sure that I want to do it.
I'm interested. One of the two questions I've got is, all the rules since 2008 are in the different versions of the territory plan since then. Before then, I think we had land use policy or something.
Yep.
And where do you find them?
Well, I've got an old copy of the territory plan from the year 2000. So that's got all of those. They were actually much easier to read.
They're not available online.
You might be able to find them. You can download from it's the legislation.act.gov.au website, and you do a point-in-time version.
But I can do that for the territory plan, but that only goes back to 2008. Where do I look for the other things?
I'm almost certain you can still pull it in, but I can't say for sure that that's the case. I've certainly got
I'm going to ask tax line.
By the way, I forwarded the results of it on the Caroline email. So she knows. Okay, next, come on, Dennis Fest celebration. Saturday the 14th of October, who's coming?
Miles.
Yeah, we're having a party at the shops on the 14th. Sea change involved the new shops, so it's quite exciting. We had a party at the shops for a while, but we haven't had any shops. But now we're actually having a party where we have shops. So CHC are involved, the developer of the old school site. The cafe has got a band coming, and so it should be a fun day. So that's going from 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock on the 14th. So,
Has it been advertised?
yeah, High Street, where there's a number, there's a notice going out to all residents. It's on our website. It's going to go in the newsletter. And we've actually got some younger people on the committee who are going to use Facebook and all that.
Oh, excellent. And if you want to give me some money, I can advertise it using Facebook, Samuel and Africa.
Yeah. So that's exciting because we haven't had shops for 10 years. So.
Congratulations on getting some shops.
Associated with that is the next one, it'll be quick. So out the door is the Bicentennial Square, which Sue was actually involved in 1988, thanks Sue. But where it's run down, the government have committed, the LDA committed $500,000 to fix that up when the school site was done. With the abolition of the LDA, the government have tried to forget about that commitment, but thanks to Carolyn Lakuta, that Brett brought to the table, we're meeting with Minister Gentleman next Tuesday to find out when that's going to happen. If Dennis pushes on the button, there's plans. The community association, the shops, and the school site developer are cooperating to get Harris Hobbs have done a plan, and that's currently on exhibition on our website. It was on exhibition outside the cafe. We got 99 submissions on what should happen, and so it was more just the information that's a project in the wings. We find out on Tuesday when we get how the money's going to come and things like that. So you'd be happy to know, Sue, that they're going to keep the bicentennial entry. That was a thing that people wanted. And they wanted to keep the rocks in the centre in some form.
That's great, thanks Miles. The bit on active travel I will leave to later because you've got a presentation on that. Section 72 Dixon and stakeholder mapping. Jane, is that you?
Yes, I don't know where things are up to because I've been away for a few weeks this month. But we do have a meeting that we've set up with the Canberra Senior Centre at the Dixon Tradies this Friday. So I just wanted to remind NCCC committee that that's scheduled for 11:30 Friday. I don't know if other people can be there.
Sorry, what was the exact?
The Canberra Senior Centre in Turner have been seeking to relocate to Dixon, and that was something that there was a design and feasibility study that the LDA actually undertook to look at redeveloping the Northside Community Service Model. And so, yes, I think this is to talk to them about what
Which is the Northside Community Service Building, one of the O'Connor shops?
No, it's in section 72, so right next to the pool, between the pool and the Anchor Gallery.
The old sort of Jumeirah.
Where we
Where
used
we
to
used to meet. Okay, yeah, I
Yes.
went there. It's
Yes.
still coming.
Oh, okay. Yes, so they're obviously stakeholders. But have there been any other?
No. I'm still waiting for an email unless it's disappeared into my inbox somewhere on that, which should be sometime shortly. Major projects, there are too many to mention.
There are quite a lot on the, for those, there's a DA Finder app, which is in now in its version 2, and what that means is if you actually wanted to see what DAs are around Canberra, you actually have to put it on your smartphone. You can't look at it on a website to see them all. If you look at it on the website, what you see is a sequential list organised either by district or by DA number. So you've got to wade through those. In Canberra Central, we're obviously grouped with the inner south. So you've got to distinguish, which suburbs apply to us. There are some really major ones in Civic at the moment. Of course, there's the Raiders Club and DA on Donaldson Street in Turner, in Braddon. And I was noticing, all sorts of interesting things. Quite a few of them are lease variations, where they're bumping up the yield from, in some cases, from 60 units to 83 units, or things of that sort.
That's within the commercial zone of Redmond, I think, isn't it?
Honestly, you can't tell because all you're looking at is the very quick summary. And the interesting thing, in fact, with that Raiders Club DA, and this is something we should probably be feeding back to ACTPLA, what they've done in the summary is to not give you any information. So what they do is to
How
say
unusual.
that you've got to look at the actual DA in order to work out how many units it is. And the whole point of that summary is to actually have that information there so that you can decide whether or not you want to look at the whole DA.
140 units.
I know from today's newspaper.
That was part of the rationale for developing the checklist, because that was sort of, you check a few things, and if they looked okay, then there you go, it probably wasn't too bad.
Okay. Dixon Courtyards. This is around the Dixon shops, and unfortunately
Jay's not here.
Jay wasn't able to make it at late notice this evening, but the Dixon Village Traders, in association with a couple of other stakeholders around there, are organising what they're calling a 7-day makeover on the 19th to the 25th of November, and they're having a couple of workshops before then. And I think Jay will actually present at the annual general meeting something on this.
That seems to be going really well.
Yeah.
And they've done, you know, a brilliant job of actually getting this to
Yeah.
happen.
They've had a couple of meetings on this, and there will be things like garden. Now, a community garden, but it'll be a community garden with a difference. Don't ask me what the difference is. But they've talked about things like heritage signage. Look, quite a number of different things. I wish they were here to tell you all about it, but unfortunately they're not. They've told me, but my brain's useless these
So
days.
this is like the civic traders have got together and
Yeah, in a similar fashion, yes. Yeah. To enliven the place, but also just to make sure that it's a people-friendly place that we can all move around easily.
Oh, and I should mention at the very end of it, on the 25th of November, they'll do an outdoor movie. So there'll be another, I think it's another studio shooting.
Okay, stakeholders meeting.
Oh, so Marianne and I.
Yes, we're both into that. That was actually, I just called up on my iPhone, what it was entitled ACAT Administrative Review and Occupational Discipline Stakeholders Meeting. I don't know that, apart from some of the lawyers who were there at the time and made some comments, it really began to be turned into ACAT as it is for the average person. I gather there's been other stakeholders meetings too. And some of the elements, I can't remember them all off the top of my head, and I'm sure Jane will be able to supply the missing gaps. But the David and Goliath issue was very patently obvious with so many people who have to confront ACAT, and if you'll come from a community group, let alone if you're going there by yourself, which I have not had that experience. I've always been with a community group. You come in with, you know, 3 or 4 people who are there with you, and across the other side you will have sometimes 2, sometimes 3 barristers and a fleet of solicitors and a lot of bureaucrats. And so you immediately do have that situation. There are a lot of things these days, as Jane has already made note of, that we can't appeal anyway. So that, I think the flavour of that did come through quite well. I think that it was a very courageous and a very good initiative of ACAT to hold those stakeholder meetings. I think that they will be writing a report about it. Jane, what else?
I was really impressed. So the senior member, Graham Mead, and Marie-Therese Daniel, and the residential member who heard our case, and were the 2 who were hosting it. And I think they were really genuinely listening to what people had to say. It was interesting. I think it started at 5 o'clock or thereabouts, and by 6 o'clock, all the lawyers had left. They obviously were not interested anymore. But the community councils stayed on, and we were there until almost 7 o'clock. And so there were a lot of things that were talked about, and I think they were genuinely interested in hearing what we had to say about things.
Good.
So it was positive.
Lake Burley Griffin. It hasn't sunk yet, has it?
Oh, that's the Lake Burley Griffin Guardians, and yes, there's they're very concerned about the potential to put lots of concrete and bitumen on West Basin to cut it down to a fairly precise summary. The fact that the development there seems to be, shall we say, somewhat interesting and rather difficult to get FOI documents about. But one of the members of the Lake Burley Griffin Guardians Guardians has actually requested FOI documents, and I think he's going to be meeting with government very soon and trying to work out why it is so difficult. The Heritage Alert is about the fact that that area does have quite a bit of heritage in relation to early plantings of park-like facilities in terms of tree plantings. And ICOMOS is the International Committee of
International Council of
Monuments and Sites. I was trying to remember the acronym and putting it all in the right place, which I have difficulty with acronyms. And the ICOMOS alert is an international, well, the alert will go international. And they are, it is in a process of being drafted. Both Jane and I have looked at it, and it will obviously go further to the ICOMOS committee itself for final drafting. I think it may be, one hopes, to be a bit of a heads up for the government to see that in fact this area, because it is a beautiful sweep with, of course, Black Mountain and the Brindabellas behind it. And so if you're looking at a site, then there's vistas there that really should be preserved for the future, and that is what ICOMOS would be, that would be one of the roles that they could possibly play. So if you look at the Lake Burley Griffin Guardians website, they have a very good website, well managed by Juliet Ramsey. Then where I am also on that, that work with that group, we're looking very much at looking at further work, how we can try and bring about changes so we have a better development. If development does have to happen, it would be better that it was much more measured, and the sorts of things that ICOMOS would be trying to emphasise being taken into consideration. So let's hope that something good will come out of all the endeavour that's happening.
Is it still the case that the ACT government sees a reasonable amount of development there as non-negotiable? Is that the case?
Well, I think it's more
Or is
complex
it
than that
still
because
up
it's
in
also,
the air?
I think you're probably right.
Yeah.
But you see, it's not just the ACT government, the NCA is very much part of the players involved. Well, it's not over till we have
No, I know.
Let's hope
There's a lot to do.
There's a lot to do. Yes, there's a lot to do indeed.
But it's good that ICOMOS is getting involved because it might shame some players, isn't it?
Well, it might. It might.
Okay.
Aspects of their plan have already failed, haven't they? I don't think they can possibly afford to
Underground.
put the archway underground or build the swimming pool that's supposed to be on.
It's the high rise that's the issue.
It's the high rise
now.
and sort of the sort of Bris Vegas attitude.
Yeah, sure.
You know, to me, I think what they've done in Brisbane is fabulous for Brisbane.
Yeah, but not.
This is a completely different scenario.
Okay, I'll move back to an item on active travel, which I think, Miles, did you have something to say on this, or was it Jane, or?
Do you want to?
We had spoken about.
Yeah. I think we just want to raise it within Downer. There's a transport committee in the TCA. I suppose it came up because we're looking we have 2 light rail stops, and the light rail also affects the buses as well, and just what the implications for the transport options within the suburb are going to be within the future. So Barbara Burns has been looking at this, but we're also looking to integrate what Gillian Hillier said last week that Watson are looking to talk to the surrounding suburbs so we can tackle it on an integrated basis. And we're also talking to Jane what's happening in Watson. Dixon, sorry Jane. Barbara spoke to the active travel people in ACT government, and they gave her the link to the practitioner tool, and there's a couple of slides just mapping,
I know, it's a little bit hard to understand. It's basically a software
yeah,
that planners, Mars and I, you can fiddle with it, and you turn things on and off, and you can see what's going on. But it's clear that there's still a lot of actual information that hasn't been inserted into it. And of course, what is particularly important is to make sure that those pedestrian networks and cycle systems link in with the public transport infrastructure, so that it actually works.
I would say in some ways this is timely in that I have to remember exactly the details, but the government is asking for budget submissions for next year. This is a regular process that happens every year, but it would seem to me, Miles, timely that you do put some things together for that. And it would be better if it could be integrated between more than just Downer, but Downer
well,
wasn't.
definitely, we're, like the group working on it, definitely, one of Watson, like the whole in the north would make sense.
Yeah. There was a notification about it, I think, to NCCC Info. But I'll have to have a look.
When do they need those submissions by? 'Cause if we're
Last week always.
No,
you know what I mean?
no.
Sorry.
I think it's the end of October. Like,
Yeah.
it's quite a way away.
It's a small amount of time away, relatively though. It'll
Yeah.
sneak up on us. But if anybody wants to turn their mind to the sorts of things that you think should be done, and we should make budget submissions on it, by all means tell us so that we can do it. Last year we got our transport position paper considered as part of the budget process. I'm not sure what really came out of it in the actual budget itself, but
Didn't see much.
no.
I was just thinking of submitting the same transport position paper again
Yeah.
for this year.
But I think it actually had a couple of slight influences, but only slight.
Is there anybody here who'd like to work up a project?
Living Street Council put up a submission for the last budget, and virtually none of it got funded, so it's still available.
Is this for projects over and above what the government would normally spend as part of its transport infrastructure, or part of what they should be spending? What does it mean? Budget submissions.
It's major infrastructure. It's major infrastructure. It's ways of generating revenue, ways of reorganising how revenue is created. So anything to do with the budget of the ACT and major projects.
If you think the money should be spent in a certain way, this is your opportunity to say.
Yeah. I'm not sure. The cynic in me says that this is just a sop to the people who say you've had influence, but the non-cynic in me says that there is some actual influence on how the money may be spent, or the priorities for spending more than just how it will be spent.
I did hear a couple of days ago that the priority is to save money where possible because there's a tram to pay for.
Well, that's one cynical view, yes.
Not very cynical.
Well, yeah.
Sorry, Leon, I didn't hear the second part.
There's a tram to pay for, so
yes.
all other money has to be constrained as far as possible.
That would make sense.
We want to make sure that the tram does actually function.
Yes.
People are complaining about rate rises and blaming the tram on it, but we haven't actually started paying for the tram, so...
But we haven't, no, because the payment actually doesn't start till after it's finished.
That's
How
right.
much do we know now about how the tram is going to affect me, for example, on a bicycle wanting to get across to the Dixon shops? Because at the moment it takes a heck of a long time to cross Northbourne Avenue. What's it going to be like with the tram? And I don't know I don't even know how it's going to work, where the bicycle tracks are going. So is this what you're talking about?
Well,
or is there some way of accessing that
think
information?
they're still working on it. The Active Travel Advisory Group has shown a plan for the way people would get across Northbourne Avenue in our last meeting, and that was to be circulated for comment, but hasn't been circulated yet. But when you consider that in peak hours, each lane of Northbourne Avenue can carry something like 600 vehicles per hour. So you've got 1,800 vehicles per hour going through on the road. The tramway will carry about 2 dozen vehicles per hour. So you could walk across Blindfold and probably never get hit by a tram.
So the people getting on and off the tram have to cross, so it might easily be easier to cross with whatever they're.
I can't see
You
how
know,
I
round in the middle.
Yeah, and how the cycle people who don't necessarily want to go across where all the tram stops are there no special crossings?
There'll be a lot of tram stops, so we won't have to cycle far to find one.
It's only 4.
Oh, I
No,
don't know.
there's going to be,
3 or 4
there are
between
21 bus stops along the route at the moment.
Okay.
There will be 13 tram stops. So there'll be 8 less stops
Yeah.
to worry about.
There's very few.
Except the bus stops are still going to be there.
No, the bus stops are all going.
No, they're not.
If they change their policies again,
There will still be buses travelling down Northbourne Avenue,
when
and
did
there
that
will
get
still be.
announced?
That has been since I first remember, before it actually.
Well,
They actually
I
settled
think
on.
I think you're about 5 years out of date then.
No, all right. I'll accept that. All right, I'm out of date.
What about children?
Except that 2 years ago they stated there will still be buses travelling down Northbourne Avenue.
Can you find that for me?
Oh, I'll try.
Thanks.
What
Sorry.
about children coming from the line in high school that, the crossing down there
Yeah.
that they use, the students?
I expect that crossing will still be there and that the lights will still be there on it.
There's going to be signals at the intersection near the ambulance station, and that they will be integrated with the signals for that crossing and the
Okay,
signals.
so
for
that's
the
all going to be.
Yeah,
It's all going
there's-
to be tied together.
It's not all doom and gloom, just some gloom and some doom. Okay.
Makes you pedal further, so it's probably better.
Well, yeah, that's what active travel is about, actually moving. Okay. Everybody stretch your legs while I find where I'm up to.
I think we're up to general business, aren't we?
Yeah, but I'm trying to find it.
Suburban and city development.
There it is. Okay, sorry about that. So, general business, suburban and city centre developments, who wants to tell me about that?
I can report that it's 26 weeks tomorrow since the marathon hearing ended. It was the 23rd of March. So we get a 6 months reprieve, and we have no indication yet what the tribunal's decision will be.
This is the Dixon Derma.
Is that unusual?
Oh, yes.
Highly unusual.
Is that suggesting they disagree, or?
It doesn't, it really doesn't bear thinking about. You don't know.
Yeah. You will do,
I think it's complicated.
Neil, you'll do your head in if you try and figure out why it's taken so long.
Many other things to consider.
Yes, yeah.
Jane, Mary, Therese, Daniel didn't give any
No.
indication.
And I really didn't want to
No.
bring it up. After all, it's actually, at least the thing has not been approved without, any changes. And so, for now, you just have to hope. And of course, what we hope is that we will finally get a good development.
I think there's an old adage, what is it? No news is good news. We can only hope.
I think that actually came under local and group shopping centres, but there you go. So we've covered that.
Two
Because
developments in Braddon, one on 125 Bavana. I I passed it on to ANU that this person wanted to put their visitor parking over in the ANU Fenner Hall parking spots. They've obviously approached ACLA and been told that the development application has been failed, but we haven't been told the ones that put in the objections. The other one was, of course, the Bradman Club redevelopment, and because it's commercial, of course, they don't have to provide visitor parking, but they're putting in 140 units. And I think the development is very good because it's only 2, 3 and 4 bedroom units. It's no 1 bedroom unit, so it's a lot, lot better than anything else going around. But they're saying there's ample parking in the city centre and on Torrens Street and Donaldson Street. And I'm just saying, what you're talking about midnight, because even at midnight, I sent to everyone today that I don't know what we can do about it because it's a commercial zone. They don't have to have it, but it does affect the amenity of the whole area. And of course the city car park, the open air one, that's going to be built on in the future as well.
Just one thing on this commercial zone now, and Jane, you might know, if there is residential within a certain distance, and it's not huge, but surely those units on at the edge of the Braddon development.
Huon Street and
no.
Within 50 metres. If there's a residential zone within 50 metres of a commercial zone.
I'm thinking at the northern end.
Then you have appeal rights. That's
Yeah.
all you get.
The northern end of the Braddon development. Surely that would be within 50 metres of.
Well, as I said, on the other side of Donaldson Street, it's only 10 metres away, and that's residential.
Yeah, so
So
get your compass out and draw circles and.
Does the fact that it's got residential in the development, that doesn't
yes,
make
it is, but it's a
residential?
different code.
Yeah.
So commercial, it's instead of being 2 car parks for a 3 bedroom, it's 1.8. Instead of being 1 car park per 1 bedroom, it's 0.8. So they reduce it all, and then no visitor at all.
What am I thinking? In the city centre, you have no appeal rights. In town centres, you have no appeal rights.
This is the community council has appeal rights.
No,
Not
I don't think we
an
do.
individual.
No, I don't think we
But
do.
that's not in the city, it's part of Braddon.
That's true.
Yeah. Well, okay, this bears checking out further. All right, petitions. Good, there are none. Parks and playgrounds, do we have anything special on that?
Just a quick thing. I had I do the Dixonia Magnifica Facebook thing, and so somebody got in touch with me. It's the woman from O'Connor who did the park there.
Yeah.
Anyway, she's come across a landscape plan for the parkland between the Dixon Lands and the North Nancy Primary School. And this was, I think, on the Institute of Landscape Architects had done some sort of a plan, which is interesting. Anyway, it's showing nature play, a lot of nature play, and she was asking, why aren't we actually doing this? Because really that's been left quite neglected. People use it to walk the dogs now, but I mean, really, it's very, very little used. Anyway, so just letting you know that she wants to get in touch with the Dixon Residents Group, which is me, to sort of do something further with this. So I'll get back to her and see if there's anything that we can do to help.
We might actually get some reasonable playground there.
I would love to get a good playground there.
Okay.
Ever since I moved into the area, I have tried to get a good playground in Dixon.
The next item is heritage.
Well, that probably comes back to my court because I'm here mainly, not only on the committee, but I'm also represent the Reed Residents Association. and we are having an exchange of letters in relation to a number of things that are not being complied with in terms of the Reed housing precinct, which is has heritage protection. Not all of Reed, just the housing precinct itself, which dates back, of course, till 1927. So there's been an exchange of letters with Gordon Ramsay, and I understand in relation to the letters that I've sent to Andrew Barr in relation to a Mr. Fluffy knockdown rebuild in Newry Street, that we're probably not getting anywhere with that. However, we have suggested that at least this house, which was refused permission twice by the Heritage Council, then went to the Major Projects Review Group and got passed. We can't do anything about its bulk and its height and the fact that it takes up more than its plot ratio should. We possibly might be able to actually get the aluminium windows replaced with the bright windows. We possibly might be able to get the black fascia replaced with a colour that is more in keeping with the rest of the streetscape. And we may even be able to get the colour of the front door changed from a rather luminous green to again a colour that is more in keeping with the streetscape of Reed. We may. The emphasis on my use of the word may.
Why do you go to the Major Projects?
Oh, that is an extremely, it's a house in a suburban block of land, but it went to the Major Projects Review Group. I thought that I think it's overkill. I would have normally thought that that would be mainly taken up with Northbourne Avenue building.
Well, if the Heritage Council have refused it twice, then that would explain why it went to the project.
Okay.
Again, it's a planning issue, which I will probably try and assist in writing that chapter for Caroline.
Can I ask a cynical question? Did these people put these luminous green doors and black fascias on their plans as a joke?
I don't know that the DA extended to that detail.
Right.
I really don't think so. But I know that I've had a long discussion with one of the officers in the Heritage unit this morning, and she has already got the letter and knows that I said, I'm not asking for the house to be knocked down and rebuilt. That would be absurd. The house has been built, and it is too big, and it does exceed the plot ratio, and it's further forward than the other one is, and it doesn't really add up to what it should. And it could have been a really nice house. But please enjoy going down Newry Street sometime and have a look on the left-hand side. It's number 46. You'll see what I mean. And it really looks odd. I'm sure it would look absolutely perfectly fine in any other suburb. But this is a heritage precinct, and sadly, it looks exceedingly odd. And it's pretty. Because it was perfectly possible to do something really good there.
And people will be pleased to know we have 4.5 minutes left, and we are now at any other business, and please feel free to hurl brickbats, bouquets, other things under any other business. Nobody has any other business.
You should mention that we have a volunteer as secretary. So I think it would be great to welcome. It's Kanza. Yes.
Oh, please.
Yes. Now, I should, we'll need to talk with the committee, and we're probably going to meet in a couple of weeks. Is that the idea? So
I must confess, this is the first time I've ever been to a community meeting in my entire life.
I hope it wasn't too much of a shock.
A huge journey.
well, we're incredibly grateful to you for coming and we'll work.
Yeah, that's good.
I'll just remind that next meeting too, it is Water Week, the October meeting where our AGM is. It's Water Week, and so we have extended the invitation to both the ACT government in terms of catchment management for water and also to Icon Water, so that we could have two people talking about the need to conserve and preserve as well as how we consume it and pay for it. And then the following meeting, which would be November, we know we're going to head to a fairly severe fire series, and we passed the imprisonment from the fiery
I do have something in there. Okay, and just before we wind up, and it's been slightly remiss of me, Masso,
Oh, yes.
how are you?
Good.
Welcome back.
Good.
Those of you who were here last month may remember Maso Nobe from Yokohama.
Oh, yeah.
Which university?
Okayama University.
Yes, was talking to us about a few things of planning and whatever. Have you anything of importance to tell us of your discoveries of what's going on with the planning in Canberra?
I used to live in here as a student 30 years ago. At that time, Canberra used to be an ideal city.
Yes.
This city is changing to an ordinary city like Sydney or Melbourne. This is my impression. I'm very sorry for that.
We're with you. Okay. I'm going to do something very unusual. I'm going to close this meeting 2.5 minutes early.